All right, Emma, how we doing? Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. April Fool's Day. Certainly, many of you out there that deserve this day. I'm going to make this a short live video. A couple of quick things. First of all, I know many of you will be interested in to know what I'm drinking. And this cocktail right here is called a Quarantini. Quarantini. Probably can figure out that. I'm actually not so sure whether I like it. This was recommended by a certain diocesan priest in East Tennessee. Given the experience I've had with it so far, I probably should not mention his name. It has gin and white rum and an egg white. Don't really understand that part of it. And then orange juice. I put pineapple juice in rather than lime. I thought it would help. Not sure that it has. And then some simple syrup. I think those are the ingredients. So, anyway, that's the drink for today. Now, what I wanted to chat with you about, I've gotten some hate mail and some criticisms I thought I would share with you all. Some of you know that my father was tested positive for the Wuhan virus, and that he first got symptoms on Saturday, so he's on day 5. His symptoms are more or less unchanged. He does not have a fever at the present time. He has cold type symptoms. So I appreciate your many prayers for him. And my mom now has a fever. So she went in to be tested for that. I would expect they're living together, and so I would expect that she has it as well. So please keep them in your prayers. Now, it may not come as a surprise to you. It was not a surprise to dear Emma that after I announced that my dad had the Wuhan, several of you more or less said, I deserved it, or that, had I repented as a result of this. Some just asked, had I changed my mind? And, this is a real insult because I can't imagine why any of you would think that I would change my mind about something I believed to be the truth simply because uh, someone I know and love was suffering. It makes no sense to me, right? I just can't even contemplate that. Like, I would abandon all of my reason and I would ignore all of the evidence that I have shared with you that support the notion that we're going through a national hysteria simply because my dad got the virus. First of all, my dad is in a high risk category. He's over 70. There are other factors. He's high risk. Secondly, he didn't quarantine. He was an essential worker. He continued to go to work like many men of that age. His work is very important to him. Uh, if he stayed at home and was doing nothing, he would probably die from that. So why should we be surprised that somebody over 70 who was not quarantined got the virus? There's no surprise. And more importantly, what does this have to do with the truth about the way the virus spreads, or how deadly it is or is not, or whether or not the national response to the virus is actually worse than the virus itself? It's completely irrelevant. Uh, I think there's another point here, too. I think this also demonstrates another point I've been saying. I have asked since the beginning of this issue why it would not simply be sufficient to have the at-risk people and the sick people self-quarantine. Why would that not be good enough? Why do the rest of us who are healthy or young or both or not at risk, why do we have to quarantine? It doesn't make any sense, because if my parents were to quarantine and I did not, and I got infected, how would that infect my parents? If I'm not seeing them, if they're not going out, if they're not being exposed to anything, how would they be at risk if I got it or you got it, but they were quarantined at home? It makes no sense whatsoever. So it's like everything else in this crisis. There's something else going on behind that that causes them to tell you what to do, but not tell you why. It's like with the masks, right? They tell you you're a regular person, you're quarantined at home, you don't need a mask. It's not because you don't need a mask. It's because they don't want you to buy a mask that they think someone else needs more, a first responder or whatever. And that may be the case. That may be a totally legitimate reason, but they should just tell you the truth instead of telling you that you don't need it, right? So the fact that I have been at home and I've been avoiding all sorts of activities, as have my 11 children who are at home and my wife, we're not doing all sorts of things that we would ordinarily be doing because of, you got to quarantine, you got to separate. And my parents still got sick. It's proof that these kinds of things don't work. In fact, I would point to Italy as a dramatic proof that quarantines in the modern age do not work. They have had the most draconian nationwide quarantines in place, fining people, putting people in jail who disobey, and they've still had a catastrophic outcome. So these are all the wrong metrics, as I've been saying before. So anyway, that's my first point. I'm going to have another sip of this, just hoping that it gets better, because it's like medicine. I'm not even sure. I'm not sure why someone would do this. It's not good, especially when you could have gin with just olives and olive juice, and that would be good. I do not recommend the quarantini any more than I recommend a quarantine as a way to handle this crisis. All right, now my second point is about this. And this point has really been driven home by the fact that my dad and most likely my mom have the virus. Many of you are Catholic. Some of you are Protestant, and a smaller number of you are pagans. But most of you, including the Catholics, don't seem to understand why I'm upset with the church. No, just a minute. I'm angry with church leadership. It really shouldn't come as any surprise. If you have been conscious for the last 60 years, there should be no surprise about how the majority of bishops and the majority of priests have responded to this. Here's why I'm angry. I'm angry because the church exists to spread the gospel and to distribute the sacraments. Those clerics are vessels of the sacraments. Christ literally died, suffered and died, so that we could have the sacraments, because we need the grace that comes from that. Now, I know you Protestants, you won't agree with that, you won't understand it, but you can follow the logic and the hypocrisy that's here. I know you'll have no problem finding the hypocrisy in the church, but you can follow the logic of why a faithful Catholic would be angry about this, because they are literally traitors to their God. They are cowards. And again, we shouldn't be surprised by this. Look at the last 60 years. Look at how they behave. But the bishops should have been united and pushing back against the state for the good of souls. That's what they're supposed to be interested in, the good of souls. Eternal life, not this life. Now, it doesn't need to be a false dichotomy. You don't have to choose one or the other, but if you do have to choose one or the other, you would choose the eternal life that's going to go on forever with no end versus the life here that's guaranteed will end. So some of you will say, well, you don't care about the priests, you don't care about the bishops, you're just selfish, give me my sacraments and all this sort of stuff. As if as if the canonical right to the sacraments, as if the very thing we've been told all our lives we need to get through the day wasn't important. So this is part of the crisis in the church, right? Is that this terrible catechesis that people don't even know what we're supposed to believe. They don't even know why we have these things. And so they reveal themselves as essentially secularists who worship the state when they criticize people for wanting the sacraments. So I would ask, just like I ask, they're forbidden questions, like, how does a person who has self-quarantined get sick from me if I don't self-quarantine? How does that happen? Well, of course, nobody will answer that. I will ask you this. How is there a risk to the priest to offer Mass publicly if he does not distribute communion and if there are no lay people trampling around on the altar, as there shouldn't be anyway? What's the risk to the priest there? Well, it's basically zero, right? So why not? That's a great question. I think you should all be asking your priests and bishops. Why do you refuse to offer public masses when there's almost no risk to the priests at all? And they're going to come back and say, well, there's just some great risk to the laity. No, there's not, because we've already said that the old and the sick and the vulnerable are at home. They've self-quarantined. The rest of us, very unlikely to get the infection, very unlikely to get seriously ill from the infection, very unlikely to die if we do get seriously ill. And even among 80-year-old sick people, there's an 80% chance of survival. So I hope this provides some perspective. So what's the risk to the priest? It's basically zero. What's the risk to the priest to hear confessions? I know some priests who are hearing confessions outside. They're in the sun, the wind is blowing, they're 6 feet away from the penitent. What's the risk there? Almost nothing. What about priests that are in their churches sitting in the front pew and they've put a rope 10 feet behind them so that the penitent can come and sit in the third or fourth pew, make their confession? What's the risk to the priest? Almost nothing. So why around the country are bishops forbidding this? It's not legal, of course, for them to forbid it. Certainly not moral. Why are they forbidding it? And why are priests obeying them? And the answer, of course, is the priests would rather obey men than God. It's a perfect inversion of what Peter and Paul would say. So, I'm not going to lose my mind over it, because I'm not surprised. These guys have demonstrated over and over and over again that they don't care about the good of souls. They're interested in being locked up in their palaces, in their cushy chanceries and rectories. And the only way to respond to that is to refuse to defend their cowardice, to hold them accountable, to refuse to financially support those who have abandoned you. Don't suffer from Stockholm Syndrome. Don't labor under, like the battered spouse syndrome. Hold these guys accountable. What good would a soldier be who was only a good soldier in peacetime? That person is a deserter. That person is a coward and a traitor. So why would we look at these lukewarm clerics with anything else other than that, right? I mean, people are working in the grocery stores and the pharmacies and the restaurants for minimum wage, helping people out with their necessities. And that's okay. But these priests hiding out in their rectories, that's not okay. Now, I'm not saying that it's all priests. We all know that within the SSPX, they've got about 100 priests here in the country, and they have continued to fly all over the country where it's still legal to serve the people. They've doubled and tripled their liturgies. They have complied with all of the local rules about how many people can be in a building at the same time, or how many groups or whatever. They're getting really creative about continuing to provide the sacraments. It's not just them, even though they're probably, not surprisingly, at the top of the list in terms of men of the church who are demonstrating that they care about souls. Here in my own diocese, there are priests who are doing what I described earlier about hearing confessions and so forth. So just keep in mind, whenever people get all worked up and they start calling you names and they start questioning your motives and your intelligence and your holiness and your worthiness to speak these contrary ideas, remind them, unlikely to get the virus, unlikely to get seriously ill. And even if you do get seriously ill, you're unlikely to die. And that's if you're 80 years old and sick. Just look at the data, okay? You're far more likely to die from an accident, a car accident, than you are this virus. And yet I bet you'll still drive. So that's it. Hands, fast and pray. It is Lent after all. Don't panic. Don't succumb to the temptation to fear. And remember that outside of the government and outside of the church, our country is full of hardworking, innovative people who are not afraid of taking risks to help other people. We're going to be just fine. Okay. And don't drink the quarantini. It's not any better than a quarantine.